Splatoon 3 is a precarious balancing act. It's in the enviable position of trying to retain the approachable nature of Nintendo's typical family-friendly vibe, while punching up the skill ceiling for players that have been with the series for the better part of a decade now. The third entry in Nintendo's zany shooter series retains the core aesthetic of splattering colourful ink over a drab area, backed with a wicked fashion sense. The same wonderful fast-paced shooting, meshed with switching between a kid and a squid, is alive and well in Splatoon 3, but the wider game struggles between appealing to newcomers and veterans alike. The campaign is emblematic of this struggle between appealing to a wider player base as possible and challenging upper skill level players. Splatoon's campaigns of yesteryear have typically had us going full hero mode, gunning down hordes of foes with reckless abandon, with all the snazzy skills and gadgets each entry could possibly introduce. They've always been fun, but typically haven't been challenging in the slightest. Octo Expansion, the DLC for Splatoon 2, felt like Nintendo flexing their puzzler muscles in a shooter setting, and the result was something that some would say rivaled Titanfall 2 for sheer creativity. But the third entry campaign feels like it's caught between more simplistic offerings of a hero shooter and the genius of Octo Expansion, but doesn't really want to settle for either one. Each separate arena comes with a toss-up of whether you'll be tasked with gunning down waves of brainless enemies or a dense puzzler requiring thinking on the fly. Levels alternate between being brutally difficult and a breeze, and there isn't an overall difficulty curve since the more challenging levels are peppered in amongst the easier counterparts. Also, nearly any level can be skipped for later. As such, it feels like Splatoon 3 has only partly learned the right lessons from the Octo expansion. There's an overriding sense that Splatoon 3 knows how to create levels requiring careful planning and deft execution that feel satisfying to beat. But this hasn't been applied evenly across the entire experience. The result is a campaign with significant difficulty spikes, and while that definitely feels satisfying and exhilarating at times, it's only ever in small bursts. So while the campaign doesn't succeed at pushing the skill ceiling up, the multiplayer offering gives players the chance to really bask in mastering new aspects of play. Slathering ink around a map and diving headlong into squid form has always been a thrill, but now there's an added dimension of various flashy movements to pull off while in squid form, which is all layered on top of a moveset the Splatoon series has already established as being perfectly smooth. For example, there's an intricate little move that you can pull off while in squid form, where with a flick of the analog stick in a direction, combined with the jump button, you'll surge out of the ink in a dazzling flash. But this isn't just for show. There's actually brief periods of invulnerability granted in this dash, meaning you can potentially hop out of the ink completely impervious to enemy fire and return fire with their own ink in the blink of an eye. It's actually really fun to sit there and learn new button combinations for a new move, one which builds on top of the other movement skills without cancelling out anything that came before. Subtle additions like this don't shake up Splatoon 3's core foundation, but instead offer dedicated and skilled players a higher ground to aim for, which succeeds in adding even more depth to an already unparalleled movement system. Then there are the little extras to consider. The threequel has finally introduced a multiplayer lobby area where players can familiarise themselves with weapons, gadgets, and movement tricks. There's a neat little rotation of maps. Old favourites like the ever-changing Mahi Mahi Resort and the vertical ink blot Art Academy return, while new stages like Hagglefish Market and Scorch Gorge keep things fresh. And the excellent Salmon Run, a PvP horde mode where up to 4 players fend off waves of small monsters and formidable bosses, has become a constant feature, rather than being on timed rotation. One new venture that doesn't quite work as intended is the card battler called Table Turf Battler. From the outlook, it sounds great. You take turns placing cards on a vertical board to conquer territory, sort of like competitive Tetris in reverse, in an effort to dominate the board like you would in a turf war match. But table turf matches come down more to chance rather than strategy. One undeniable tactic is to march up the board as quickly as possible and cut your opponent off. So if vertical playing pieces just happen to come up in your hand, you're more or less guaranteed a win. So, while Splatoon 3's campaign feels like it's stuck between being a brilliant shooter and standard action fluff, rather than blending the two together for a seamless and enjoyable experience, the multiplayer and supporting Salmon Run are still just as great as they've always been. There's excellence in Splatoon 3, it just doesn't quite hold for the campaign. We give it 4 stars.